For years, people whispered about the man behind the medals. They said the most decorated soldier in American history came home from Europe, carrying something he could never quite put down. They said his temper could turn in an instant. They said money slipped through his fingers as fast as it came in. They said he was not always faithful. And they said his second wife knew every bit of it and chose to stay anyway. For decades, these were just rumors, the kind of talk that follows any famous man once the cameras stop rolling. But after Audie Murphy died in a plane crash in 1971, the woman who had shared his home for 20 years did not disappear into quiet widowhood. Instead, through the way she lived the rest of her life, Pamela Murphy gave the public something closer to the truth than any tabloid ever could. This is the story of what those rumors were, and what her life after his death actually revealed about the man she loved. Audie Leon Murphy was born in June of 1925 in Hunt County, Texas, one of 12 children crowded into a sharecropping family that never had enough of anything. His father left for good while Audie was still a boy, and his mother died when he was only 16, a loss he would describe decades later as something that took a piece of him and never gave it back. He left school before he reached his teens, picked cotton for wages that barely counted as wages, and hunted small game with a rifle just so his younger brothers and sisters would have something to eat. There was no softness in that childhood, and there was very little safety either. By the time the rest of America was worrying about Pearl Harbor, Audie Murphy had already spent years worrying about survival. When the war came, he was too small and too young by official standards, and every branch of the military turned him away at first. He was underweight, underage, and on paper he did not exist as a viable recruit. But he pushed until a birth date was altered, and the Army finally took him in the summer of 1942. What followed was not the story of a boy easing into military life. It was the story of a young man who seemed to find, in combat, a kind of clarity that nothing else in his life had given him. Murphy's rise through the ranks during the Italian and French campaigns reads less like a career and more like a series of near-impossible escapes. He fought at Sicily, at Salerno, through the brutal stalemate of the Italian mountains, and into southern France, where his reputation as a soldier who simply would not stop began to take shape. He was wounded more than once. He caught malaria more than once. Each time, he went back to his unit rather than staying in a hospital bed, as though staying still for too long was somehow more dangerous than returning to the front. The action that made him a household name came in January of 1945 near the town of Holtzwihr, in the freezing chaos of the Colmar Pocket. With his men pulled back to safety, Murphy stayed alone near a burning tank destroyer, calling artillery strikes on his own position, and then climbing onto the wrecked vehicle to fire his machine gun at advancing German infantry and armor. He held that position for close to an hour, already wounded, until he ran out of ammunition. Estimates of the casualties he inflicted that day run into the dozens. For it, he received the Medal of Honor, becoming by war's end the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War, a title that would follow him, and in some ways trap him, for the rest of his life. When a reporter later asked why he had taken on so many enemy soldiers by himself, his answer was short and almost matter-of-fact. They were killing his friends. It was not a boast. It was closer to a confession about what actually drove him through those years, and it hinted at something people would not fully understand about him until much later. Audie Murphy came home from Europe with a chest full of ribbons and a mind that would not settle. What we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder had no widely accepted name in the 1940s. Doctors and soldiers alike called it battle fatigue, or simply nerves, and there was little structured help available for men who had seen what Murphy had seen. He suffered from insomnia that stretched for days, recurring nightmares, headaches, and stretches of depression, so heavy that people close to him sometimes did not know how to reach him. A medical evaluation not long after his discharge noted that he was sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow, a small but telling detail about how far the war had followed him home. He leaned on sleeping pills to hold off the nightmares, and by the mid-1960s he recognized that he had become dependent on sedatives. Rather than hide it, he did something unusual for a famous man of that era. He shut himself in a hotel room alone for a week and broke the dependency through sheer will. He also became one of the earliest public figures to speak openly about the psychological toll of combat, pushing for the government to take veterans' mental health seriously, particularly as young men began returning from Korea and later Vietnam. It was a strange contradiction that defined much of his life. Publicly, he was becoming one of the most visible advocates for understanding what war does to a soldier's mind. Privately, he was still fighting that same war every single night. Murphy's path into Hollywood began almost by accident, when a photograph of him as America's most decorated soldier appeared in a national magazine and caught the attention of actor James Cagney. Cagney brought him to California, arranged acting lessons, and gave him a place to stay while he tried to find his footing in an industry that had nothing in common with the battlefields of France. The partnership did not last, and Cagney would later say bluntly that Murphy simply could not act. But Murphy did not quit. He trained with an acting coach, practiced monologues from Shakespeare to smooth out his rough edges, and slowly built the relationships that eventually got him small parts in forgettable films. His breakthrough came in 1949 with a leading role that the studio back in the picture would only greenlight if Murphy himself played the lead. That gamble paid off, and Universal signed him to a long-term contract. Through the 1950s, he became one of the most reliable stars of the Western genre, a quiet, steady screen presence who often played men carrying something heavy beneath the surface, a quality that likely required very little acting at all. The peak of his film career came with the 1955 adaptation of his own memoir, a project he initially resisted because it meant reliving the worst days of his life on camera for the public to watch. He agreed anyway, and the film became one of the biggest box office successes in his studio's history. Long before his name became attached to Pamela Murphy, Audie had married actress Wanda Hendricks in 1949, and for a brief moment the two of them looked like one of Hollywood's golden couples. The reality behind that image was far darker. The trauma Murphy carried from combat did not stay contained to his private thoughts. According to Hendricks' later accounts, his mood could shift violently, and he sometimes kept the gun within reach even during arguments at home, occasionally pointing it in her direction in moments of rage. It was a kind of detail that, decades later, would seem almost impossible to reconcile with the image of the war hero smiling on movie posters, but it was consistent with a man whose nervous system had never fully stood down from combat. Their marriage lasted only a matter of months before Hendricks left, and the divorce was finalized in 1951. It was one of the first cracks in the public's tidy image of Murphy, and it fed the earliest rumors that something was not right behind closed doors. In the period between his two marriages, Murphy also earned a reputation, according to friends and co-stars, for pursuing women quickly and intensely, only to lose interest just as fast. Actors who knew him described a man who could be charming and generous one moment and distant the next, a pattern that people close to him tended to connect back to the same restlessness the war had left behind. Just 4 days after his divorce from Hendricks became official, Murphy married Pamela Opal Lee Archer in April of 1951 at a church in Dallas. Pamela had worked as a flight attendant for a Texas-based airline and was introduced to Murphy through a mutual acquaintance. Unlike the world of premieres and studio parties that came with his fame, Pamela preferred a simpler, more private kind of life, and that difference seemed to be exactly what drew Murphy to her. He had already lived through the chaos of a marriage built on public image, and with Pamela, he appeared to be searching for something steadier. Together they had 2 sons, and Pamela built a home life around them in California, where the family also raised horses on ranch properties in California and Arizona. To the outside world, this looked like Murphy's happy ending, proof that the war hero had settled into a peaceful, ordinary domestic life. But the truth, as it so often is with public figures, was more complicated than the photograph suggested. Pamela was not simply a quiet housewife standing beside a famous husband. She was a woman managing a marriage to someone who still woke up in cold sweats, who still carried a temper capable of frightening those around him, and who was beginning to develop other pressures that would only grow heavier over time. By the 1960s, the whispers about Murphy had expanded well beyond his war trauma and his volatile first marriage. People in Hollywood talked about his heavy involvement in horse racing and the money he poured into that world, money that increasingly outpaced what was coming in. He later admitted to losing a substantial sum in a failed overseas oil investment, and he found himself in prolonged disputes with tax authorities over unpaid obligations. Friends and observers noticed that a man who had once been one of the top-earning actors in Hollywood was quietly sliding toward financial trouble, even as he continued to appear steady and successful on screen. His temper remained a persistent undercurrent as well. In 1970, he was arrested in California following a violent dispute with a dog trainer and was charged with assault, accusations that included allegations he had fired a shot at the man during the confrontation. He denied the most serious claims and was ultimately cleared, but the incident reinforced what people had been saying for years, that beneath the composed public figure was a man who could still, in the wrong moment, become someone unrecognizable. Combined with the older stories about his first marriage and his reputation with women, these later incidents kept a steady undercurrent of rumors circulating around him even as his film career began to wind down in the late 1960s. Through all of it, Pamela stayed. She raised their sons, managed a household increasingly strained by financial pressure, and continued standing beside a husband whose private struggles rarely made it into fan magazines. Whatever she knew, whatever she had witnessed firsthand over nearly 2 decades of marriage, she never used it publicly against him, even when their finances and his temper gave her every reason to walk away as Hendricks once had. On May 28, 1971, Murphy was killed instantly when the private plane he was traveling in went down in poor weather near Roanoke, Virginia. He had been headed to inspect a potential business investment. One more attempt to stabilize the finances that had been shaky for years. He was 45 years old. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, and among those who attended were figures who would later become national leaders themselves. President Nixon issued a statement praising Murphy as an embodiment of the courage of America's fighting men. In death, as in life, the public narrative remained fixed on the hero. What almost nobody outside his closest circle understood was the scale of the debt and disorder he left behind, debt that would fall entirely on Pamela's shoulders. This is where the real answer to the old rumors finally came into focus. Not through a tell-all interview or a dramatic public confession, but through the way Pamela chose to live for the next 4 decades. She did not sell a scandalous memoir. She did not go on television to settle scores or confirm the darker stories that had followed her husband for years. Instead, she quietly absorbed the consequences of the life they had built together. The debts Murphy left behind forced her out of the large home they had shared and into a small apartment, an almost jarring come-down for the widow of one of the most famous men in America. Rather than seek public sympathy, she took a clerical job at a veterans hospital in Los Angeles, a position she would hold for the next 35 years. It took her nearly a decade of steady, unglamorous work to pay off everything Murphy owed, and she did it so thoroughly that people who knew the family would later say no one could ever claim Audie Murphy had failed to make good on a debt, because his widow made absolutely certain of it. That single choice says more about the true nature of their marriage than any rumor ever could. A woman with nothing left to prove to the public, free of any obligation to protect a dead man's reputation, chose instead to spend a decade of her life quietly restoring it through her own labor. If the rumors about his instability, his spending, and his temper were true, and by most credible accounts they were, her response to them was not exposure. It was loyalty. At the Veterans Hospital, something remarkable happened. Pamela did not simply process paperwork from behind a desk. She became a fierce advocate for men who came through those doors, many of them fellow combat veterans wrestling with the same invisible wounds her husband had carried. She walked patients into doctors' offices when she felt they had been made to wait too long, drawing formal reprimands she never seemed to regret. Veterans would approach her in tears once they learned whose widow she was, and over the years those emotional moments shifted from being about her husband's memory to being about her own reputation as someone who genuinely fought for the men in her care. When budget cuts nearly forced her out of the job in 2002, veterans protested until she was allowed to stay. She kept working there until she was 87 years old. There's a version of this story where Audie Murphy's rumored instability, his temper, and his financial recklessness simply confirmed that he was a difficult, damaged man unworthy of the hero worship that surrounded him. But Pamela's own choices after his death complicate that reading in a more interesting way. She never denied the hard parts. Friends and biographers who knew the couple confirmed the difficulties in their marriage, the mood swings, the financial chaos, the weight of untreated trauma. What Pamela's life revealed in the decades after his death was not that the rumors were false, but that she understood something the public never fully grasped. That the man behind those difficult moments had also been shaped by things almost no one else in her life had endured, and that loving him meant carrying both the hero and the wounded man home from the war together. Pamela Murphy died in 2010 at the age of 89, survived by their 2 sons. By then, her own story had become inseparable from his. She was no longer remembered only as the widow of a famous soldier and actor. She was remembered as a woman who turned private hardship into decades of public service, who paid off debts that were never legally hers to pay, and who spent her working life caring for men who reminded her every single day of the husband she had buried. So when people ask whether the old rumors about Audie Murphy were ever confirmed, the honest answer is layered. Pamela never sat for a dramatic interview naming every dark night behind closed doors. But she also never denied what close friends and biographers already understood to be true, that Murphy's war trauma, his temper, and his financial instability were real and had shaped their marriage profoundly. What she did instead was more powerful than any confession. She spent the rest of her life proving that behind the flawed, sometimes frightening man the rumors described, there had also been someone worth an extraordinary kind of loyalty, the kind that pays off another person's debts without complaint and spends 35 years caring for strangers simply because they reminded her of him. Audie Murphy remains one of the most complicated figures in American military and film history, a man capable of extraordinary courage on a battlefield and equally real struggles once the fighting stopped. His story is not simply one of triumph, and it is not simply one of tragedy either. It is the story of a man who never fully came home from the war, and a woman who, even after he was gone, refused to let the rest of the world see him only